So this actually happened to a singer named Nora back in 1997 in Kuwait. And I know everyone says their ghost story is true, but this one is different. Nora was pretty famous back then. She had this incredible voice and ran a wedding band that was basically the go-to group if you wanted your celebration to be remembered. And you know how it is with wedding singers in the Middle East. They are like rock stars in their own right. But anyways, it was a regular summer evening when she got the call. Kuwait in summer is absolute hell, by the way. So here we're talking 45 plus degrees Celsius, like 113 Fahrenheit, the kind of heat where your car's steering wheel can burn your hands. And Nora had just gotten home from another wedding gig, probably exhausted when her landline rang. And remember, this was 1997. No mobiles really, just those chunky home phones everyone had. And the guy on the other end spoke in really formal classical Arabic. That was the first slightly weird thing, but whatever. Some of the older, traditional families still spoke that way. He said his daughter was getting married, and he'd heard Nora was the best. Could she and her band perform in 3 weeks? Nora checked her schedule, and the date was free, so they talked money. He was offering good money, half up front like usual, and then he gave her the address. And this is where it starts getting a bit odd. The location was way outside the city, past the 6th Ring Road out toward Jarrah, then another 20 kilometers beyond the farms. He said someone would meet them at a water tower to guide them the rest of the way. Now, this wasn't completely crazy. Lots of wealthy families back then still did weddings at home instead of hotels. The really old money families, the ones whose wealth came from pearls and trade before oil, they often had these massive estates outside the city where they could celebrate privately, away from the prying eyes and gossip. So Nora didn't think too much of it. The money showed up 2 days later, cash in an envelope, no return address. A bit unusual, but some families are weird about privacy. 3 weeks passed, Nora and her band practiced all the usual wedding songs. You know, the classics, the ones every Khaliji wedding has to have. Khaliji basically means Gulf Arab. So we're talking traditional songs from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE, that whole region. Her band was tight. Layla played oud, that's like a Middle Eastern lute, this beautiful pear-shaped string instrument. Mariam was on drums. Fatima and Sarah did backup vocals. And this young guy, Hassan, handled all their equipment. They've been performing together for 7 years and had an amazing reputation. The day of the wedding came. They loaded up 2 cars, Nora's Land Cruiser and Hassan's speed-up pickup truck, and headed out just before sunset. They drove north on the Jarrah Road, watching the city gradually fade into suburbs, then scattered farms, then just desert. The water tower appeared right where the guy said it would be, this massive concrete thing rising out of nowhere. And there was someone waiting, a man in traditional dress, wearing a white dishdasha, that's the long white robe Gulf men wear, and a red-checked gutra, the headscarf, his face half covered in the dim light. He gestured for them to follow him and got into this old Mercedes that looked like it was from the 70s, but was somehow gleaming like new. They followed him off the main road onto what was barely even a track, just tire marks in the sand, really. Layla was riding with Nora, and she started shifting around uncomfortably. "This is really far out," she said. "Rich people like their space," Nora replied, but honestly she was starting to feel uneasy too. You know that tightness in your stomach when something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. They drove through the dunes for like half an hour in the dark. Kuwait's landscape is so flat and featureless that at night you can get completely disoriented. And then suddenly, there it was, this absolutely massive mansion. It was built in the old Kuwaiti style, you know, with wind towers, these traditional cooling towers that catch the breeze, and courtyards, but huge, way bigger than it needed to be. And every window was blazing with light. Despite being in the middle of nowhere, it looked perfectly maintained. The Mercedes just disappeared around back, and their guide was gone before Nora could even say thanks. A woman met them at the door, fully veiled in that old-fashioned way you hardly ever saw by the 90s. She led them through these gorgeous corridors with Persian carpets and brass lanterns, past rooms full of cushions and low tables loaded with dates and Arabic coffee. The whole place smelled intensely of bukhor. That's traditional incense made from wood chips soaked in fragrant oils, really common in the Gulf, but like a lot of it, almost too much. You will perform here, she said, showing them to this big courtyard open to the sky. And there was a proper stage set up with outlets and everything. The bride arrives at midnight, started warming up at 10:30. Then she just disappeared before they could ask any questions. They set up their equipment while the women changed into their performance outfits. Those elaborate, heavily embroidered dresses and jewel tones, hair domed up high, full stage makeup. This was their work uniform, basically. Hassan got the sound system running, and they did a sound check around 10. But something weird happened during the sound check though. Nora's voice echoed in this really strange way, like the space was too big and too small at the same time. She brushed it off as acoustics being weird. At 10:30, the guests started arriving. And this is where things got properly strange. They just appeared. Like 1 second an area would be empty, and then you'd look again and there would be a cluster of people there. They came in groups, women in traditional dress, men in white dish dashas, emerging from doorways, rounding corners, just suddenly being there. Within 20 minutes, the courtyard was absolutely packed. Easily 300 people, maybe more. Nora had performed for bigger crowds, so she wasn't intimidated. She nodded to her band, and they launched into a traditional welcome song. The crowd seemed to love it, ululating loudly, that high-pitched trilling sound women make at celebrations, and they started to dance. But something felt off. At first, Nora couldn't figure out what was bothering her. The guests were enthusiastic, maybe a little too enthusiastic. They danced with this intense energy, with their movements strangely fluid and synchronized. It reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite place what. She glanced over at Layla, who was playing mechanically, staring at nothing in particular. By 11:30, the weirdness had become impossible to ignore. The way these people moved, it wasn't quite human. That is the only way to describe it. Joints bending in ways that looked subtly wrong. They danced without stopping, without even pausing to catch their breath or chat with each other like people normally do at weddings. The dancing was hypnotic, almost ritualistic, like the same movements repeating over and over in patterns that made Nora's head hurt to even watch. Some guests came up to the stage to offer congratulations and tips, totally normal wedding behavior. But when the first woman pressed money into Nora's hand, Nora felt something that made her blood run cold. The woman's skin was burning hot, not like a fever, but like touching something metal that's been sitting in the sun. And hard, leathery, completely unlike human skin. The woman smiled with these really white teeth and went back to dancing. Nora caught Fatima's eyes across the stage. Her backup singer had gone pale under all her makeup, and her hands were shaking on the microphone. She'd felt it too when someone touched her. Nora gave a tiny shake of her head. Don't react. Keep performing. The night dragged on. Midnight came and went. No bride. The crowd just kept dancing, getting more and more frenzied, more synchronized. Nora's throat was killing her, but she kept singing. Her professional training kicking in even as terror built in her chest. Next to her, Miriam was pounding the drums mechanically, her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. And then sometime after midnight, Nora was never sure exactly when, everything changed. She was in the middle of a song when she noticed. At first, she thought the incense smoke had gotten thicker, making it hard to see. But then she saw clearly. and she wished she hadn't. The legs of those guests weren't entirely human anymore. They ended in these hooved feet, dark and cloven like a goat's or sheep's, moving with an animal's grace. Their hands, when they raised them while dancing, had these elongated fingers that tapered to points, nails gleaming like horn. But their faces were still human, and that was somehow the worst part. Human faces smiling and laughing on top of these increasingly inhuman bodies, dancing, always dancing. Sarah's voice completely cracked. She'd stopped singing, just standing there with her mouth open, frozen. Hassan at the soundboard had gone gray, looking like he might pass out. Only Nora, Layla, Mariam, and Fatima kept going, pure muscle memory and performance discipline overriding their terror. The things dancing, Nora couldn't think of them as guests anymore. They didn't seem to notice or care that the band was freaking out. They danced harder, their movements becoming unmistakably inhuman. So she kept singing, voice cracking, tears streaming down her face and ruining her makeup. The others kept playing, looking like they were barely holding it together. Time stopped making sense. Each song felt like it lasted hours. Nora's entire world became just next note, next breath, next moment of not running, not screaming. And then, at what her watch later told her was 3 a.m., every single light went out. The darkness was total, like, how dark it gets in the deep desert. No streetlights, no ambient glow, no moon that night. Nora literally couldn't see her hand in front of her face. The music just stopped. Nobody decided to stop. Their hands just fell still in the dark. And with the music gone came silence, complete, unnatural silence. No breathing, no footsteps, just rustling fabric. The courtyard that seconds ago held hundreds of dancing figures was utterly, impossibly still. The temperature absolutely plummeted. Nora had been sweating in the August heat. Suddenly her sweat felt icy on her skin. She could literally see her breath misting. Frost formed on the microphone under her fingers. Yalla yalla! Layla's voice cut through the silence, raw and terrified. Yalla basically means let's go or hurry up in Arabic. You yell it when you need to move now. So they ran. They abandoned everything, all their instruments, the sound equipment, purses, shoes, everything, and just ran blindly through the darkness. Nora's heels caught on a carpet and she kicked them off, running barefoot through corridors that seemed to twist and stretch impossibly. The mansion felt enormous inside, way bigger than it should have been. Corridors multiplying, rooms opening into other rooms in ways that made no sense. And then suddenly they were outside. The desert, which had seemed so ominous approaching the mansion, now felt like salvation. Open space, stars, the distant glow of Kuwait City on the horizon telling them which way was home. They ran to their cars, fumbling with keys with shaking hands. Both engines started, thank God, and they just drove into the desert without headlights, too scared to wait, too scared to look back. They navigated by moonlight until they hit the main road. They didn't stop until they saw that water tower again. Then they pulled into a patrol station on the outskirts of the city as dawn was breaking. Under the fluorescent lights, they looked at each other, faces streaked with tears and smeared makeup, hands still shaking, eyes haunted. Nobody spoke about what they'd seen, not then. What could they even say? Nora went to the police the next day. They listened politely while she tried to explain what happened at a mansion in the desert. But when she tried to give them the address, that's when things got really weird. An officer actually drove out there with her. The water tower was there. The track into the desert was there. She could even see their tire marks from the night before in the sand. But there was no mansion. Where that huge house had stood, there was just desert, undisturbed sand, some rocks, a few scraggly desert plants. No foundation, no debris, no sign anything had ever been there. The officer looked embarrassed for her and suggested maybe heat exhaustion, stress, maybe someone had pranked her by leading her to an empty plot. But Nora knew what she'd seen. They'd all seen it. So she went to the library and dug through old records, newspaper archives, property registries, and finally, in some dusty file of historical documents, she found it. A mansion matching that exact description had existed in that location. But the mansion had been abandoned in 1987, exactly 10 years before Nora's performance. In the weeks after, Nora tried to contact the man who'd hired her. Disconnected number. The courier company had no record of delivering that money. It was like the whole thing never existed. And Nora, she never performed again. She was only 35 at the peak of her career. When people asked why she'd retired so suddenly, she gave vague answers about wanting to focus on family, about the demanding schedule, whatever. People who knew her well could tell something had happened, but they didn't push. But the story got out eventually. Stories like that always do in Kuwait. It's a small place, everyone talks. It spread through whispers and got more elaborate and less believable with each retelling. Some said she'd seen ghosts at a wedding. Others said it was all a hoax, that she made it up for attention before retiring. But people who knew Nora, who saw that haunted look that never left her eyes, knew she was telling the truth. In Islamic tradition, jinn are real beings, created from a smokeless fire, living parallel to us, able to take different forms. They are basically supernatural creatures mentioned in the Quran, not genies from Aladdin, but actual entities with free will. They marry, they celebrate, have families, die just like humans, but according to their own ways. Sometimes through accident or intention, the worlds overlap, and humans end up somewhere they were never supposed to be. And there are rules, apparently, for these encounters. You have to be respectful. Once you accepted their hospitality, you can't just leave. You can't insult them or freak out. You recite protective prayers, keep your cool, and only leave when dismissed. By continuing to perform, even as reality twisted around her, by fulfilling the contract despite her terror, maybe Nora accidentally followed these rules. She and her band were allowed to leave, traumatized, but alive. The mansion, if it was ever really there, is gone. The desert around Kuwait holds a lot of secrets. The traditional desert nomads who've crossed these lands for centuries know this. Sometimes the old folks say, we're not the only ones celebrating the desert night. Sometimes the jinn have their weddings too. And if they call for musicians, they expect to be entertained. And Nora knows this now. She lives quietly in the Kuwait city with her family. She doesn't perform anymore, but sometimes hums old songs to her grandkids. She never drives toward Jara. She never answers calls from numbers she doesn't recognize. And every August, when it gets hot and thick with desert dust, she locks her doors at sunset and burns bukur until dawn, praying that whatever still dances in that empty place in the desert has forgotten about the singer with a beautiful voice who once performed for them. Some invitations should never be accepted, and some performances are meant to last forever. And that was one hell of a story, right? The story is quite famous on the internet, and there are some variations to it, but the core remains the same. Whatever those things were, they weren't human, which is super creepy if you think about it.